Perfect. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today and to address this very important topic. I think when I was first asked to speak about rights violation and discrimination against women in migration, my first reaction was, yay, okay, finally we're addressing the subject. And my kind of second reaction was, well, which women? Who are these women? How do we answer this very, very big question? So just to kind of to start with this, let me just outline a few principles, I guess, that will help us think through these kinds of issues. I think the first principle that is worthwhile for us to kind of reflect on is exactly that there is no one narrative of women. There is no one women group that we can talk of as a homogeneous group where migration is a kind of an experience that they all experience in the same way. So I guess that kind of helps us focus what we are talking about. The second thing, I think it's very, very important to situate women's migration experience in the larger context, women, meaning looking at women's experiences within the the employment system, within the social system, within the economic system, and really looking at situating this within these structures. This third principle, and I think that's very, very important, is that in order to understand rights violation and in order to really understand discriminations and to move forward, we must start by looking at the most vulnerable. We must address the situation of the most vulnerable. So with that in mind, I was very excited to see kind of the results of the poll today, because for the longest time, activists in the Asia and Middle East region have been saying, well, our story of women in migration is a little bit different than the global story of women in migration. There is something very specific within this kind of migration corridor, something very difficult as well. And I'm very, very happy to see that the vast majority of people on the line today are actually either from the Middle East region or the Asia region. So I hope what we are going to talk about actually relates to some of these experiences. In order to kind of start thinking about rights violations and discriminations, I know we kind of tend to automatically shift to conditions in countries of destination. That's kind of the natural tendency. But I think we must start looking at rights violations and discriminations as something that starts to occur even in countries of origin, even before women are about to embark on their migration journey. And this is very well established. We've known this for a while, that there are a number of things and policies that occur at countries of origin that results in rights violations and discrimination. So let's cite a few here. Let's start by talking about bans, for instance. We know that a number of countries of origin have put in place bans that affect women. Some of them target women specifically, meaning bans that don't allow women under a certain age to migrate. For example, we can give the example of India, for instance. We can give the example of Nepal, which has really fluctuated a lot in putting in place these kinds of bans. Whereas other kind of bans, they target women in the sense of women with children are not allowed to migrate. Let's look at the example of Sri Lanka, for example, where this is the case. Two other examples where women are not specifically mentioned, but it's implied. So for instance, bans against domestic work in general are kind of blanket bans, but these are occupations that we know are traditionally women. The issue is, and we've known this for a very long time, civil society has been raising the issue constantly, that such policies have not worked to protect the rights of women. Oftentimes, governments use the pretext of protecting women with a framework of a protection to say that we need to put in place policies such as these, but evidence has really showed that instead of protecting the rights of women, and this is where the focus should be, these kinds of policies have resulted in more dangerous journeys for women falling victims to traffickers, falling victims to paying fees, falling victims to all sorts of rights violation in the migration journey. In addition to all these things, we know that when bans are in place, for example, women who migrate, they are considered irregular in their countries of origin. And we hear a lot of stories, of heartbreaking stories of women who are not able to return back home to visit their families, to visit their children, precisely because we have bans in place. In addition to bans and restrictive migration policies, there is also a stigma associated with migration, and I think Paula touched upon this. There is a stigma sometimes associated with the kinds of jobs that women do in destination, for example, domestic work. There is a stigma with women leaving and being the breadwinners and all of that. And this acts as a social barrier for women's migration. So we know that a lot of, the decision whether to migrate or not sometimes is also influenced within the family and the perception of a woman migrating. So it's not just a question of policy, it's also a question of societies. This is on the countries of origin side. On the countries of destination side, and this is where kind of the problem gets even worse, rights violation occur. And within the corridor of the Asia, Middle East migration, there are all sorts of problems that we can look at. I think the first problem to really address and look at closely is specifically the type of work that women migrants end up doing, the kinds of sectors that they are in. And we know from looking at the evidence, for instance, and I'm giving the statistic from the Arab region, 62% of women migrants in the Arab region alone are domestic workers. And this gives us an idea about the sorts of job, for example, women do. So far we know that women are employed in sectors that are, largely informal, sectors that are undervalued and underprotected. And we know that these sectors are often perpetuating a division of labor that exists in all our societies already, whereas men are seen as the ones who do the productive work and women are kind of seen as the ones who do the reproductive work. In the Middle East region in particular, and I'm sure all of you have heard at least something about the sponsorship system, we have this particular problem. This is really a problem for women as well, because it links the status of the migrant woman to that of her employer, making mobility very, very difficult, making the legal status of the woman in question dependent on her employer. And this has created a lot of dependency. This has created a lot of migrant workers ending up in situations of irregularity as a result of rights violation because of this close linking. The domestic worker sector, for example, is one that in this region has kind of stayed on the fringes of the law. If we come and examine the laws of a number of countries in the Middle East, starting from, like Lebanon, for example, like other countries, like Qatar, for instance, we find that domestic work does not fall under the labor law of the country. So it's either something that falls outside of the law completely, and then it's a contractual relationship, or something that is regulated, as in the example of Bahrain, of certain segments of the labor law that applies to it. So we really know that there are kind of legal difficulties in protecting the rights of women who work in sectors such as domestic work. The other difficulty in this corridor in specific is the whole question of the temporariness of the migration of women. And we've known this for a very long time, that people come on temporary contracts, but end up staying a lifetime. So we have people who stay for 20 and 30 years on temporary contracts without even the possibility of gaining status. This protracted temporariness is something that has caused, the denial of rights for a very, very long time for a very big category of women migrant workers. The other thing I would like to focus on, and if you notice the title of this slide, I'll just read it out because this is very interesting. It says, "You are here to work and not to have children." And these are not my words. These are the words of an immigration officer in Lebanon who was explaining to a domestic worker why her visa was being denied, her visa to support her child. So there is this wide perception that migrant women workers, in particular domestic workers, are here just to work. They don't have entitlements to have families. For the large part in low-skilled mobility scheme, migrant women are denied the right to have families, meaning the right to bring family with them, so family reunification is denied, but also the right to get married and have children and have families in countries of destination. And if you remember, we've spoken about the temporary permanence situation in which these women are. So a lot of them are in countries for 20, 30 years, and their lives are just on hold. Their family rights are just on hold. Other countries, this is smarter or sneakier because they put in minimum wage requirements bring families. Some put occupational requirements, meaning if you're a teacher, you can have a family. If you're a domestic worker, well, definitely not. This is gendered because it's really affecting women disproportionately. In addition to all of this, in a number of countries, and I think this is very particular in the Middle East region, we have something called as the zina laws. The zina laws are a set of laws basically that punish any kind of sexual and reproductive relationship outside of marriage. So in addition to not being able to support their families, not being able to have their children and all of that, if someone, and especially a woman, is kind of found to have engaged in sexual relationship outside of marriage, she could face jail, sometimes flogging in some countries, and deportation. And we know from evidence that this tends to affect women more than men disproportionately. They are the ones who end up being accused of committing zina. They are the ones who are jailed and deported. And unfortunately, in cases like this, pregnancy is seen as proof of the actual act of zina. Having said that, and that connects very, very closely to kind of the next point, for the longest time in this region, we've been saying that access to justice and access to remedy is such a difficult thing, especially for migrant workers, especially for lower skilled migrant workers, and in particular for women. For instance, let's take the domestic work sector as an example. We know when women, if women come forward actually, and when they do, there is a tendency not to believe them. There is a tendency to believe the employer. There is a tendency to ask women to unproportionately bear the cost of proof and all of that. There is a problem in terms of access to these kind of police stations, to these kinds of courts, to also interpreters, to understanding the legal system. So, I mean, a lot of women, just from the cases that we've worked on, we know that they would rather do anything but go to court and claim their rights in court, precisely because it is so difficult, precisely because their status is dependent on their employer. And so the moment they come to kind of, pursue a claim, their status becomes a question. They lose any legal standing or any legal grounding. And because of the cost associated with the justice system. We've known that for a very long time in the Middle East region, for example, the vast majority of cases of disputes are settled outside of court. And those usually results in compromises on rights. Those are, for instance, solved through mediation, or sometimes, the migrant worker says, okay, I'll just take what I can get, because if I go through the legal proceedings, it's gonna be a long process. I'm not sure they're gonna even believe me. I'm not sure I know how to navigate this. I'm not sure I can afford a lawyer, so I'll just take what I'm offered. So this is kind of the conclusion of how justice is actually never served in this region. The other point that I want to touch upon is the speciality dimension of this. And this is really, really striking, because just by looking at cities, for instance, in the Middle East, just by looking at public spaces, you can see the social exclusion and isolation that migrant women, and especially domestic workers, are in. In the situation of the household, we know that women are isolated within the household. Many are unable to leave the household, unable to communicate with families. But outside, the segregation is also apparent, and the social exclusion is also apparent. Go to any restaurant, for example, in the Middle East, and the first thing you will notice is that the family's having dinner together and the domestic workers are sitting together, oftentimes without eating. So this is a very common sight in the Middle East. This segregation and this isolation is something that, that goes against kind of the human instinct and the human need to connect and the human need to be able to live in societies. And this, we find it very, 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 very frequent in the Middle East. And we know that integration is not happening. Now, in terms of the impact of COVID, I think Paula mentioned a lot already. Just to say, in this region, we've noticed that the numbers of infection are actually less in women. And this is not because women are getting all their rights, but precisely because of the kinds of, men's labor in the Middle East region, labor camps and crowded accommodations in which men are actually present. So we noticed that the impact has been more on men. In terms of the other kind of aspects of COVID, so the aspect related to the economic crisis, we know women are feeling the brunt of it. We know they are very affected. We've heard a lot of claims and problems related to women who are not able to work and are not able to get their daily pay, especially with those who are undocumented and who depend on finding daily labor. We've also heard that, we've also noticed that generally reporting of violations has gone down. And this is not because there are less violations, but precisely because people are now saying, I'm prioritizing my daily needs. So I need emergency assistance, I need food, I need shelter, etc., etc. In sectors such as domestic work, for instance, we know conditions are worsening. People are complaining of longer hours, they're complaining of excessive work. And now with the whole kind of obsession with cleanliness, domestic workers are even forced to use more cleaning materials that could be hazardous, etc. Now we're also seeing a large wave of returnee migrants to countries of origin, including a lot of women who have lost jobs and are being also returned to their countries of origin. Finally, I think I just wanted to shed light on the whole notion of oppression, agency, and resistance. We often tend to focus a lot on the problems facing women. We focus on the rights violations and the discriminations, but we forget in our focus on problems to highlight that throughout all of this, women are also challenging the system. They are challenging the system at the micro level, they're challenging it at the macro level, and there are numerous examples to support this. When systems tells you you cannot have family and you have a family, you are challenging the system. When the system tells you you cannot change employers, but you still find a way to change employers, you are still challenging the system. I think women, despite all of the structures in this kind of corridor that go against them, they have managed to make something from their immigration experience. They have managed to make it as a source of empowerment, as a source of income for many families at countries of origin. And I guess the first proof that speaks to the agency of women, that speaks to their resistance to kind of systems that exist, is that despite knowing all these kinds of risks and dangers, women continue to migrate in the hope of seeking a better future. If I have one more minute, I'd just like to kind of focus on how can we... Yeah, one more minute? Yes. Great. How can we go forward? Because we spoke a lot about problems and all of that. And I think the first thing we need to look at is how unequal the system is, right? Because at the beginning, I've mentioned that 60% of women's migration in this region is actually a migration of domestic workers. So why don't we start questioning that? Why don't we start asking for more diverse and safer pathways for women migration? Not in domestic work sectors, but in other sectors. How can we have more women migrants come into these other sectors? The other point that I think is very important to stress is that we need to look at the informal sector in particular, because this is where a lot of these rights violations happen, and to find ways to formalize this informal sector while ensuring decent working conditions and social protections. Finally, I think looking at access to justice is very important, and making this justice work for women is something that we need to look at. And I would say the biggest thing for this particular region is working on the rights of mobility. So meaning breaking this dependency between the status of women and that for employer, even in cases of women's dependency on their spouses, breaking the cycle of dependency and having women being able to move forward in the labor market. With that, I will end. Thank you very much.